The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Kia ora tātou, this is Toby Manhire with a special one-off bonus edition of Gone by Lunchtime. We will be returning to normal service with Ben and Annabelle in just a few days. Today, my guest is Sam Sachdeva. His day job is as National Affairs Editor at Newsroom. And he's just published a book all about the balancing act that is New Zealand's relationship with China. It's called the China Tightrope, Navigating New Zealand's Relationship with a World Superpower. It's a good pacey read, and it traverses all the issues in the sort of geopolitical and domestic areas for New Zealand. That relationship will be in the foreground in the days to come as Chris Hipkins leads a trade delegation to China. Our editor, Madeline Chapman, will be there on the trip, so keep an eye on the spin-off for updates from China. It's the first trip by a New Zealand Prime Minister. I think it might even be the first trip by the leader of a Five Eyes nation since 2019 when Jacinda Ardern visited. That was a truncated trip as a result of coming soon after the terrorist attacks in Christchurch. It does make it, though, a perfect time to talk with Sam about the bilateral relationship, about the tensions between China and the West and the Pacific, about the importance of that relationship to New Zealand and to China too, about Chinese interests in New Zealand, and I challenge him to tell the future and tell us all what's coming in the years ahead for the relationship. Here he is, Sam Sachdeva. Kia ora, Sam. We'll get into the crunchy stuff from your book, The China Tightrope, in a moment, but let's deal up the top with what's right in front of us, which is Chris Hipkins, the Prime Minister, and quite a big, quite high-powered trade delegation winging their way to China. How big a deal is this trip for New Zealand, and what would success look like for Hipkins and co.?
Look, it's a pretty big deal. For one, you just do the math. It's been 4 years since we last had a Prime Minister go there. That was Jacinda Ardern in 2019. But I think we all remember that trip was heavily curtailed due to the terror attack in Christchurch. So it was only a couple of days on the ground. So we're actually going back to John Key, and I think it was 2016 maybe when he last went. 2015 is the last major prolonged trip by a New Zealand leader. So it is a big deal. So much has changed in the last 5 years, right? Or the last 10 years. In terms of success, it's kind of an interesting one. There's not a lot of tangible wins that I think Hipkins can expect to take away. We signed an FTA upgrade not that long ago. Trade is the heavy emphasis, mainly because talking about anything else gets very touchy. Right. So it's going to be more that symbolism, I think, of taking businesses over there and saying, look, we're here, we're happy to do trade with you. Come send your tourists here, send your international students. But it's more sort of vibes and photo ops, I think, than any sort of, here, we've signed this new shiny agreement.
When you talk about trade being the focus, of course it is. And the challenge there, the head of NZTE, Peter Crisp, was quoted in Business Desk talking about how he said a shift in consumer sentiment associated with the rise in nationalism and the rise of patriotism in that particular market presents a challenge for New Zealand exporters, for New Zealand businesses. And that also, I guess, points us towards what you just described as touchy, which is that change in China over the last 5-10 years under President Xi. Can you give us an overview of that, a helicopter view of how China is different, certainly from 2008 when that FTA was signed?
Yeah, I think we've seen under Xi, and in particular in a second term, so I think, what was that, 2016, 2017, or 2017, 2018, a much more sort of assertive foreign policy. There's this line that Deng Xiaoping said that is used to death, but it is because it was apt for the time that we, hide our strength and bide our time. And so the idea was that, yes, China's going to be a power, but we'll hold back on the world stage and we'll just focus on ourselves. And that's gone now. So we've got a much more muscular, assertive, foreign policy approach from Xi Jinping, a sense that, China has been a rule taker for so long. If you look at things like the UN and the World Trade Organization, other countries, Western countries, are telling China what to do. Now it's time for China to set the standards. So there's been that. Then there's wolf warrior diplomacy, which gets talked about a lot. And that's sort of a manifestation of that more assertive approach, where you have diplomats sort of lecturing other countries about why they've offended China and how they've hurt the feelings of 1.4 billion people, and how dare you criticize us on human rights or economic coercion or anything. So it's sort of a heightening of kind of the underlying currents that were already there, but it's really stepped up a bit under Xi, and particularly now that he's got his second term and has consolidated power around him.
And what about internally? I mean, in China, there's certainly for foreign media working there, but I think generally for those who are interested in civil liberties, there's been a tightening, hasn't there? And also, as far as the human rights situation is concerned, for example, in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, things have not moved in the direction that some observers, international observers, might have liked.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's always been this hope that as China opened up or liberalized economically, that would flow through to its sort of societal settings, and you'd have maybe slightly more democratic inclinations, and that hasn't been the case. If anything, I think Charles Adele, who I spoke to for the book, had said that they've managed to sort of use technological advances and the sort of the trappings of more wealth to pour into surveillance equipment. If you look at the number of CCTV cameras they have around China, I think it's one of the most surveilled countries in the world, if not the most. London might be hit as a city. So there's that, and you're right. I think that the space for debate, freedom of expression, what limited space there was, has shrunk even further for Chinese academics, Chinese students, any sort of human rights groups that are there, and they're very minimal. It's an incredibly controlled space, and has been for some time, but it's getting even more restricted. So I think the freedom of those within the country to speak out about areas of concern is heavily curtailed.
Chris Hipkins had a curtain raiser act in the form of Anthony Blinken, who is, of course, the Secretary of State for the US, and he's completed a trip to China and had some very long meetings there and ended up getting a meeting with President Xi, which wasn't necessarily guaranteed at the outset. That was a postponed trip. I think it was postponed because of the balloons over the American continent saga.
Spy balloon gate.
And it seems to have been, and we're speaking sort of shortly after that trip is finished, seems to have been, a slight thawing in relations between the two countries. So that's not a bad time for Hipkins to be arriving, I suppose. Better than on the heels of say Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah. I mean, maybe Blinken and Xi were exchanging beverage tips for Chris Hipkins. If you remember, Anthony Blinken ceremonially presented Chippy with a Coke Zero and PNG.
Oh my God!
So I could pass that on.
Oh, that's right. We're gonna have to suffer through Chinese sausage rolls, aren't we?
Yeah, sausage rolls and Coke Zeros at the Great Hall of the People. It'll be quite a vibe. No, I think it is a good sign, and it's probably a continuation of what we've seen over the last year or two, which is both the US and China saying, look, the underlying dynamics here aren't going to change. We are going to compete. We do disagree on a lot of things, but actually we don't want it to go off the rails, and we don't want to have some misunderstanding or accidental collision in, say, the South China Sea turn into a full-blown conflict because we're not talking to each other. So it is helpful. Having said that, Blinken did go over hoping to re-establish military channels of communication, and the Chinese have said no to that so far. So that's not ideal, but I think it's good. I think you're right. It's good that you've got both sides at least willing to talk and say, look, we need to keep things at least stable, even if we're not going to suddenly become best of friends overnight.
One of the things, or your book is about a tightrope, and we'll come to what that tightrope is in a moment, but there's also, when dealing with China, diplomacy as a whole, particularly with China, I think, there's also tripwires. And so one of the things that Hipkins has to be alert to, and I'm sure he will have been briefed, and he'll be cognizant of all of this, is the sorts of language that you don't use, particularly around Taiwan when you're in China, right? And we saw, Biden, whether he misspoke or meant to in recent times, sort of he veered away from that, what is it called, strategic ambiguity?
Mm.
What are the sort of things that Hipkins will be looking out for when he's there in that area?
Yeah, well, we also, New Zealand politicians seem to have a very bad habit, while they're in New Zealand rather than in China, of referring to Taiwan as a country. Normally when they group it in with a bunch of others, when we say, we've been talking to Australia, Taiwan, Canada, and other countries, and then they have to correct themselves and go, actually, no, we're talking about economies. So it's that sort of strange language that's there. So it's avoiding anything around that, but it's also the flip side is not being sucked into saying anything that could be used as not propaganda, but pushed to by the Chinese state media and other Chinese outlets to sort of promote the Chinese line on things like AUKUS, like Five Eyes. They've been quite good, the likes of the Global Times and the People's Daily, at trying to drive a wedge between, for example, New Zealand and Australia. There were a series of stories a few years back when things were really at a low ebb, and commentators saying, "Oh, why can't Australia be more like New Zealand and be more respectful of China and be more positive?" So I think it's anything that feeds into that will be something for Hipkins to watch out for.
Right, and that's one of the reasons, because we can, obviously we're a pretty insignificant country in the world on the whole, but that is one of the areas certainly that we're important to China, aren't we? And we can see that through the state media, is as a member of Five Eyes and as a country in the Pacific, it works to their advantage to be able to say this lot are better behaved or similar, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We are probably the friendliest Western country, and I'd put Western in quote marks because it depends how you think about it, but of the kind of traditional West, we're probably one of the friendliest countries towards China. So it's useful for them to say, look, we don't need to have this competitive or conflict-driven relationship. Look at New Zealand, and the fact that we've got this long history of firsts. It was the 4 firsts for a long time. Now it's up to 5 or whatever. We're first Western nation to sign an FTA with China, first Western nation to support them into the WTO. I'm sure you know all of this, but that's useful for them to be able to hold us up and say, look, here's this small nation that's very different from us, and yet we've signed all these agreements, and aren't they going so well?
And on Five Eyes, there was some tension, and you touch on this in the book, not too long ago, when Five Eyes, which is a surveillance alliance rather than necessarily a geopolitical bloc, when Five Eyes countries started issuing statements around Hong Kong, I think, particularly, and the incursions on liberties in Hong Kong. How did that play out in terms of our relationship with the Five Eyes versus our relationship with China?
Yeah, I think it really kind of hit the headlines, and I'm just struggling to remember. I think it might have been 2020, or in fact, it would have been. I think it was the first speech, or one of the first major speeches from Nanaia Mahuta, where she gave a very considered address about the dragon and the Taniwha. I'm sure it was combed over by MFAT people, had pretty much nothing of any note in it in terms of sort of striking lines, but it was in the Q&A afterwards, and she said, look, we're a bit uncomfortable with this, that the purview of Five Eyes is expanding. It is an intelligence alliance. We don't think we should be talking about these different issues. And then you had, I think, was it Alexander Downer, the former Australian foreign minister, saying, "Oh, it's always been Four Eyes." and any sort of outrage sort of cries from the UK and Australia and everywhere else. And it's a bit overblown, and it does happen every few years. There's these stories that we're on the cusp of being kicked out of Five Eyes, and I just don't think that's realistic, because we do bring something to the table. Even though, as you say, we're a small nation, we've got unique connections into the Pacific, unique connections to the rest of the world, and we're fairly trusted, I guess, as an international player. So that probably brings value to the Americans and the British and so on. So there's this kind of angst here in terms of mission creep from Five Eyes. Should it really be talking about foreign policy or defence or whatever else? And there's a kind of a weird way that we finessed it, where we say, yes, we're still going to do things, but we're just not going to call it Five Eyes. It's 5 countries. We have a 5 countries ministerial on immigration, or a 5 countries meeting on cyber terrorism or whatever. So it's this kind of weird diplomatic solution to it.
And then you chuck into that mix the more recent development of an actual military alliance in the form of AUKUS, which of course is Australia, the UK and the US, who are Five Eyes members too. We're not part of that. There wasn't a consideration for us being a part of that, at least not insofar as what's the main pillar of it. There's been this talk around Pillar 2 of AUKUS. Can you give us a sketch on what that means, and importantly, how China might respond to us signing up to such an arrangement?
Yeah, so you're right. It's split into 2 pillars. Pillar 1 is the Australians getting their hands on nuclear-powered submarines. And that's, one, it's not really for any other country to join, because it is very specifically about Australia. And 2, it's just totally off limits for us. Andrew Little, Defence Minister, who's been kind of positive about joining onto some parts of AUKUS, has said, that's off limits. But Pillar 2 is the one where there's greater possibilities for us. So that's kind of advanced technologies that they've bundled in together in terms of cyber warfare, quantum technology, hypersonic advances, and so on, and artificial intelligence, which everyone's talking about at the moment. So it's saying, they're looking at how can we set standards in this area, how can we collaborate on research, and that's the bit where I think New Zealand is in. We're not even in discussions about joining. We're in discussions about having discussions about joining. So,
yeah, there was some slightly different messages that were coming from Andrew Little and Nanaia Mahuta at one point, weren't there? In terms of the kind of, but broadly, that was about a sort of level of enthusiasm. It seemed like, rather than process. It's still there isn't an offer on the table, right?
No, and there won't be until after the election, at the very earliest, I would say, maybe for a new government, possibly longer, because it's a really knotty issue, and it's kind of interesting if you look at the reaction it's had in New Zealand. Some people I've talked to have compared it to the TPP as it was, when you had sort of like 10,000 people going down Queen Street in Auckland, or even before that, the Iraq War, when you had protests. And it hasn't got to that scale yet, but in terms of what it touches on, in terms of our nuclear-free identity, this kind of anti-American sentiment that we seem to still have in some parts of New Zealand, which really interests me. And that probably goes back to us being kicked out of ANZUS. You've got the Pacific communities who are concerned about what that means for the Pacific if we have a militarization of the region. And we talk about a lot about Chinese militarization and concerns around the Solomon Islands Agreement and so on. But if you've got all of a sudden nuclear-powered submarines on our doorstep in Australia, what does that mean? So it's actually kind of got an interesting constituency of different interests who are really concerned about this. And I think that's why the government has sort of rode it back, yet Andrew Little being very enthusiastic, as you say, and Nanaia Mahuta not so much, but they kind of got on the same page now, which is to kick it into the long grass and sort of talk about some of the bigger picture issues there.
I mean, it's fair to say that there's a reasonable likelihood that behind closed doors it will be intimated, reinforced with Chris Hipkins while he's in China, that joining up with AUKUS would not be a sensible thing to do as far as advancing the friendly relations between China and New Zealand?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't think they will want us to join at all. Having said that, if you look at Australia, which, as one of the founding members of AUKUS, is getting these nuclear-powered submarines, they've been in that for a few years now. Actually, their relationship with China is improving.
Right.
And it's not perfect, but it kind of shows that actually being in the mix with these things is not necessarily, doesn't spell doom or death to the idea of a strong trade relationship or relationship in other areas. So it's kind of interesting to look at what's happened over there. You had the trade minister going. I think Albanese is probably going later this year. So, it's kind of interesting. You can disagree in quite fundamental ways without necessarily jeopardizing the whole thing.
Right. And in some ways we're vulnerable because you could argue that the sorts of commodities that we're exporting there are less essential to to China's economy than those that Australia is exporting. But similarly, there's an argument to be made that we're perhaps a little too timid. It's possible to have a range of different views in bigger parliaments, for example. I mean, you talk in the book about Simon O'Connor and Lewis Wall, who's no longer in parliament, being these voices who are a bit more open and vocal in their criticisms of CCP and so on. In the UK and the US and in Australia, I think it's partly a function of having bigger parliaments and less kind of strict whipping systems. But there is more of that. Are we sometimes too timid? Australia hasn't necessarily suffered, and it's been quite pugilistic in moments. But have we been too timid sometimes in holding back from criticising China?
I think we've probably got space to be a little more outspoken, and I think we have seen a slight change under this government, where there's been a slightly more forward-leaning, shall we say, bullish approach. We've probably still got scope to do a little bit more in this space. There are risks, like you talked about the pugilistic approach in Australia, and what we saw under, I think, Scott Morrison, Peter Duff, and some of the language that they used there, and the full-blown sort of trade war. We had Australian beef, barley, wine having tariffs of like up to 200%, so tripling the cost of exports to China. There are downsides, so it's a careful line to walk. I guess the thing is, if we get to the point where we just don't talk about sensitive issues, where we have strong disagreements because it could hurt our exporters, and you kind of say, what's the point? We have national interests, national values that we should be willing to articulate, and we should do those with every country, the US, Australia, whoever else. So I think we're kind of learning and moving slowly, but we could definitely ramp it up a little bit more without, going too far.
You talked about the Pacific, you talked about the Solomon Islands, and what happened with the Solomons when there was a leaked document describing a military pact of sorts, sort of access really for China and the Solomons, which of course is very close to Australia, geographically speaking. That sort of set off a big swivel of the spotlight in New Zealand and other parts of the world to the kind of contest, as in old speak, of the theatre of the Pacific, in terms of a tug of war. Really, it seemed as though, analysts pointed out that the West maybe had created a vacuum into which China had exploited. That contest changes again New Zealand's relationship, doesn't it? Do you want to give us a kind of quick overview of that, if you could, of how that played out and what it means for that China-New Zealand relationship?
Yeah. So we have been in the process, I think, even before that Solomon's deal, of changing the way we deal with the Pacific, and part of that is it's due to the concerns around Chinese influence. Under Winston Peters, we had this Pacific reset, which was, we're being too paternalistic, we're too sort of dictatorial, we need to work in partnership with them. But that's, like you say, it's gone into hyperdrive after the Solomons Agreement. And there was a sense that, what have we done wrong? What's happened that's left a gap here, and had the Solomons looking to someone like China. And this was Jacinda Ardern's argument that, we should have Pacific-led solutions. You come to us first. Why haven't you talked to us? But look, in terms of the wider implications, I mentioned this earlier, but if you've got military bases, and not even military bases, even sort of dual-use facilities, and if you've got agreements where, yes, the Chinese Navy can dock in our port and refuel or whatever, to what extent does that sort of bring the potential downsides of these sort of these tensions, like a harder military component to our region? So there's that, and there's just the influence building from China, which, they're entitled to do to a degree, but what does that mean for us and the sort of relationships we've had with the Pacific. We like to pride ourselves on, having a strong relationship, having large Pacifica population in New Zealand. But, what happens when you've got China throwing large amounts of money around, and they put a lot of money into infrastructure there? Some of it's been good, some of it's been not so good. So it's kind of knotty there. And then you've got also the sort of resource implications, because I think that's why there's at least a reasonable degree of Chinese interest in the Pacific is fishing stocks. I think timber to a degree, they export a bit from there. And, we want to help protect the Pacific, but also probably New Zealand has an interest in being able to have sustainable fisheries stocks in its neighbourhoods. So, there's a few different issues there, and it just puts a little more pressure on us.
Just very briefly, a sidebar on Winston Peters that you mentioned. I really enjoyed hearing from him in your book. I think it's easy to forget when he's in full-on outside Parliament opposition mode that he's actually quite a thoughtful.
Weighing in with soybeans and a baby show straight out of Norburn, Missouri, we have Soybean Festival. From Hayward, Wisconsin, at 73 years young with the world's largest muskie statue, put it together for Muskie Fest. Finally, packing a punch with fire dancing and a pet costume contest, the Roseau, Minnesota Fall Harvest Fest. One of these festivals could win $100,000 in the Cenex Hometown Throwdown. You decide. Cast your vote at CenexHometownThrowdown.com. Cenex, powered locally.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spin-Off or wherever you get your podcasts. Foreign minister, diplomat, down to the little things he says, like he always made sure that he wouldn't condescend to the Pacific Islands, and he arrives wearing a suit because rather than some, colourful shirt, that it was, did you enjoy that? Did you enjoy those conversations with him?
I did. And I wish we saw more of it. When he's not in a ministerial portfolio. I had a recent argument with him on Twitter about his nonsense around the WHO, and
it's like a different guy, isn't it? It's like a different person.
It is, yeah. I mean, Jekyll and Hyde, or whatever cliche you want to use, but it's like, how can you reconcile the person who says that sort of stuff with someone who is a statesman and can be very sort of disciplined and eloquent when it comes to this? So, I did enjoy it. And for all the grief he rightly gets, and I think he deserves a lot of criticism, he's actually represented New Zealand very well in the times when he has been foreign minister. It's just the kind of noise and nonsense around the edges that kind of clouds that.
How did you go on? How did you get on getting people to speak to you for this book? Jacinda Ardern turned you down. But you've got quite a few. John Key is there and articulating his position. Generally, you don't get much more dovish than John Key in terms of China. How did you find it generally in terms of, were people forthcoming? People, analysts, politicians, who?
Yeah, it is tricky. And across the board, I would say I had difficulty. I mean, academics are the easiest ones, and some of them are quoted there, but I think they have good things to say. Politicians, certainly current politicians, was harder. I had senior ministers who I talked to and would say, look, I can talk to you anonymously, not on the record, that had indicated interest. And then I sort of followed up and said, what about this date and that date? Or, hey, what's going on? It just kind of fell into a hole. Same with the business sector. You've got quite senior business people who were very leery of saying anything just because of the risks, I think, too. If I say something wrong and it affects our industry, and all of a sudden we can't get exports into China. So there were difficulties there, and I think that's telling in itself of how the relationship has changed, where you've got people who are afraid of talking, even anonymously in some cases. But no, look, I think I got a reasonable cross-section. It was one of those things where if I'd had twice, 3 times as long, could have done twice, 3 times as many interviews, and it would have been great. But actually, to have the likes of John Key, who is the most dovish of doves, and he acknowledges that he's an outlier when it comes to China among his sort of contemporaries in the West. And then you've got former diplomats, current diplomats who I talked to, members of the Chinese community in New Zealand who are the ones who are experiencing a lot of this interference or influence concerns firsthand. It was good overall, but it was certainly interesting to see the people who kind of ran away from any suggestion that they might want to talk about this.
Right. Well, you did call it the tightrope, didn't you? And that's the reality of it for them too. There are inherent dangers in
some
that.
People just don't want to step out. If you don't step out, you can't fall off.
Come for a nice, brisk walk on this tightrope with me, your friend Sam. Hey, a large part of the book is focused not so much on the kind of the geopolitical dynamics, but New Zealand and the role of China in New Zealand. Now, there was that, you refer to it, that headline, was it ABC? No, it was Channel 9, 60 Minutes, the New Zealand, which is a triumph of punning. But now, hyperbole, right? New Zealand. But is there some truth in it?
Some, probably a tiny segment. And that, as an aside, that was really a masterful piece of... certainly the promo, this is all real, I think, where you had, Michael Barnett seductively winking at the camera and talking about being friends with benefits, and it was there, just what are the Kiwis doing to us now? And it was quite something. But we're just in a very different position to Australia. Similar in terms of trade exposure, which is kind of interesting for all that they talk about this. They send a similar proportion of their exports there. But Australia much more closely linked to the US, still in AUKUS. Sorry, not still in ANZUS. They are still in AUKUS. They've got American Marines, I think, stationed up in the Northern Territory, and just more inextricably linked with the United States. And I think we are a little bit more ambivalent in that regard, and we are more advanced than them, I think, in our relationship with China. And that possibly is what leads us to be a little bit more equivocal on some of these sort of things. So I think the idea that we were selling the Australians out is hyperbole. It's very much so. But are we heading on different tracks when it comes to China and when it comes to our place in the world? I'd say yes, and it's going to be harder for us to reconcile that. I mean, Australia had a big defence review that they released recently, and I think Rob Asen from Vic Uni described it to me as prescribing missiles for breakfast, lunch and tea. So if you look at what they're doing, they're going to have nuclear-powered submarines, they're going to have a lot of long-range missiles. They're just heading in a totally different direction to us, and I don't think it's something we can't afford to have missiles. I don't think we'd want to have missiles or anything like that. But it's kind of interesting, those divergent paths we're taking, and what does that mean for the trans-Tasman relationship when we are so close to each other geographically, but also culturally.
So in the book, you survey a whole range of areas in which Chinese influence might be being felt across New Zealand, all the way from Parliament, where there's been speculation around the role of some MPs, through donations, in the media, particularly the Chinese language media in New Zealand, and sort of general kind of cultural organizations and a whole range of areas, business through Huawei's involvement in 5G. It's a really interesting area, isn't it? Because at once we need to be alert to it, but we don't want to be paranoid, and we certainly don't want to feed xenophobia or racism, right? Like, for example, having a Chinese New Zealander in our parliament is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something that was very much on my mind while I was writing this, and with the people I spoke to, is that there is a risk if you talk about these things and you get too sort of vague in your language or prone to generalization, then you start to cast aspersions on all Chinese New Zealanders, and then we don't want that. And we've had a bad history in that space. I mean, I have one chapter where I talk a little bit about the sort of the past relationship and some of the terrible things that we've done. There was the poll tax all the way back in the 1800s, but more recently it was the 1990s, I think, where we were talking about the Asian invasion and, what about all these Asian people who are coming here and bringing crime and riots and whatever. And it was nonsense. It was scaremongering. But at the same time, you talk to two people in the Chinese community, and I spoke to Seming Mok, for example, and some others who aren't quoted by name, and they say, look, we want, members of the Chinese community need protection as well from any state interference. People come here because they want to be able to express their views freely and have freedom of belief and so on. So anything that impinges upon that is very concerning. So yeah, I think it's about being very nuanced and careful with your language when you talk about this. You don't just talk about, China's doing this or the Chinese are doing that. It's the Chinese state, it's the Chinese government,
right,
and so on. And it's not getting caught up as well in saying that anyone who is in Parliament is a spy for a foreign nation. But I think in the cases of Jiang Yang and Ren Hua, clearly there were grounds for concern. I think from the people I spoke to and from the reporting we've seen in the past, including from Richard Harvin, the politic who broke the story, the intelligence agencies talked to Labour and National, whatever they were told, it was enough for them to act. We can't pretend that this is all racist or xenophobic either when there are grounds for concern.
What's next, Sam? Do a bit of crystal ball gazing for us. What are the fault lines in the next 5 to 10 years? Obviously, Taiwan is sitting there as a big risk factor in geopolitics for the entire world. Tell us everything that's going to happen, predict the future. and finally, I guess the answer to the question that is posed by your book, invited by your book, is, do we have to choose? Do we have to choose? Some people in your book think we do, some think we don't. So that's just a very straightforward, easy question for you to answer. The future of the world and whether we have to choose.
Can we record like 6 different versions and then in 10 years' time we resurface whichever one is actually right?
Of course.
Look, I think Taiwan, this was a no-brainer. It doesn't really take much extraordinary insight to say that is going to be the big issue. I think China has said that we will be reunified with Taiwan. We want to do it peacefully, but we'll do it by force if necessary. So I don't necessarily buy the analysis that we've seen from some in the American military and I think some of the Australian media that we've got war around the corner within the next 2-3 years. I think wars are expensive in terms of money, people that you risk losing, and disruption. So I don't know that China would want that. It's really a last refuge, I think. It's an act of desperation like we've seen with Putin in Ukraine, and I don't know that China's at that stage yet. I think we're going to continue to see some angst or work around this issue of, what's called decoupling. So, American-led companies, technology companies, refusing to use Chinese components and vice versa, and that's going to be very concerning for us, I think. If you've kind of got an American tech system and a Chinese tech system and an American trade system and a Chinese trade system, that's really damaging for small countries like New Zealand who we don't have the resource to be putting money into 2 different types of tech or whatever, sort of meeting different standards. So that's something to watch out for. In terms of the tightrope and do we have to pick a side, I don't know that we do. It probably depends on how you define that. I think if worst came to worst and there was a war, was a conflict, which nobody wants, and least, most of all us, do we know which side we would be on? I would tend to say yes. I think Andrew Little said words to this effect recently when he talked to Audrey Young in the Herald, and he got a bit of blowback for that. But it's kind of true. Like, we are, in terms of the sort of interests and values, we are more closely aligned with the United States than with China. Does that mean we should want war to happen? Absolutely not. We should do everything we can to avoid it. But
we're very clearly aligned with the West, right? Like, we're very clearly aligned. It's not really ambiguous.
No, and I don't think that should be controversial to say. It's self-evident, really. But I think we can still sort of walk a line, and I think what we need to be clear on, and I think to the government's credit, they've been pushing this line recently this year, and I agree with it, is that having an independent foreign policy is not the same as having an isolationist foreign policy. It doesn't mean we kind of hide from the rest of the world and cower under the bed sheets and refuse to work with anyone.
Nor does it mean having a neutral foreign policy, right? Independence and neutrality are separate things.
Exactly. This idea that, we can be the Switzerland of the South Pacific if you leave aside sort of what Switzerland has that makes that possible. Yeah, people tend to conflate those two or those three, if you say, independence, neutrality, isolation. What it means is that we'll make decisions and we trust ourselves to make decisions in our own interests. And when those align with the US, we will work with them. When those align with China, we'll work with them. And when countries do something that threatens those interests, then we will say as much. So I think we can do it. It's going to take a bit more work and a little bit more coverage, and we probably need to invest a bit more in some of our capabilities. And as an aside, I think it's not strictly relevant to the book, although I mentioned it towards the end, is we actually need to be building up our capability in terms of, I think, languages programs and such through universities. It's kind of concerning what we've been seeing at Vic and Otago, and it looks like languages courses are going to get a lot of have a lot of the cuts. So we're kind of going backwards at a point when we probably need to be actually investing more. But look, I think it's manageable. It's not going to be easy, and the underlying dynamics, those US-China tensions, the pressure that we'll face from each side, those aren't going to go away. But I think we can kind of pick our way through it.
Hey, last thing I wanted to touch on, Sam, before I let you go, and you're about to head off overseas for some work and some fun. You are an unusual breed now in your incarnation at Newsroom as I think you're called the National Affairs Editor, but covering security, defence, foreign affairs, all that sort of stuff. There's relatively few of you in New Zealand. If you go to the UK or the US or Australia, you'll have, most major outlets will have someone who's in charge. The papers in the UK, you'd have someone on security, someone on defence, and then a foreign editor with a whole desk of people who are overseeing correspondence, all of that. What's it like being you're not alone. There's Thomas Manch and a few others who have sort of focus in these areas. Do you think what's the case for having more of that in New Zealand? My view is that it would be good for us. Christopher Luxon was calling us inward looking the other day, and there's some truth in that, right? Like, would you like to see more people focused on that area? Do you feel a little bit lonely from time to time?
Oh, I do, absolutely. I need more friends, foreign policy nerds around me. But no, I think there is, and of course, you could say maybe of course I'd say that, given I'm already working on it. But
or you could say you don't want any competition. You could say no more. I've got it covered.
There is that. More scoops for me, please. But actually, I think we are better served as a nation and as a media by having more journalists working in this area. It has improved since I joined Newsroom. I started in 2017 with a foreign affairs focus as foreign affairs editor. And it was very lonely then. Now we've got, I think you mentioned Thomas Manch's staff, Audrey Young at the Herald, who does a bit more there now that she's not the political editor. But there's still a lot for us to be looking at and talking about. And the international environment is only going to get more complex. I don't think we're going to miraculously see a return to the golden post-war era, Fukuyama's end of history or whatever. So we need people who are able to sort of pick this apart, both in terms of explaining to New Zealanders why they should care and what this means to them, but also taking a critical look at how our government approaches this, how our diplomats approach this, because they are not infallible and we have made mistakes. So I think it's an investment that's only going to reap rewards. But can media outlets afford to do it? I don't know. Times are tough at the moment. Everyone's really uncertain about the economic environment. But I hope that once things do stabilise on that front, we have more outlets willing to put in the time and resource to get journalists recovering our place in the world.
Hey, Sam, thanks for coming on this special edition of Gone by Lunchtime, Rival Podcast. It's been fascinating and fun to talk to you. And good luck overseas.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Toby.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spinoff. You can help us keep all of The Spinoff's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.